Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all. So here we are, we're in Philippians, and if you remember week one of our walk through Philippians, Andrew talks about joy in community. So there's a through line throughout the letter to the church in Philippi of joy, and joy is not something that we experience when something happens to us. That's happiness. Happiness happens when something happens. We experience joy in spite of circumstances, in and through all circumstances. And Paul gives us in Philippians the secret to living a life full of joy. In fact, in 1 Peter 1, Peter talks about us being filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, the end result of our salvation now. So if you want to experience your salvation now, then the experience will be one of inexpressible and glorious joy. And so as we walk through Philippians, we'll find the key to finding joy in all circumstances. And week one, we talked about joy in community, so much more than meeting together for an hour and a half every Sunday and talking about the weather. This is proper community where we share lives with one another, where we genuinely look out for each other's needs. And I heard some beautiful stories off the back of that sermon that week, where in villages people expressed the need that they had, and the need was met by other people in the village. And I've heard a couple of stories like that, and it's beautiful to see it happen. That's the koinonia, that's the deep fellowship that Andrew was talking about that week. And through that fellowship, we experience joy. Second week, Liam talked last week about the joy that we can have in suffering, despite suffering. So it's not the joy of suffering, it's joy in suffering. And Paul, as you may know, wrote this letter whilst chained to a Roman guard in a prison in Rome. And yet he rejoiced. In fact, he sang and worshipped and rejoiced so much, God intervened, broke the chains, the whole place was shaken, and they just carried on worshipping. He experienced joy despite the craziest of circumstances. And so Liam talked more about that, and there's this beautiful line in the passage from last week: to die is gain, but to live is Christ. And essentially what he's saying there is we don't find life in all its fullness by being like Christ, doing the stuff that Jesus did. We find life in Jesus. He is the reason for our life. He is our joy. And so therefore, it's not the absence of suffering, it's the presence of Jesus. And now this week, I'm talking about joy in humility. So, if you like, the secret to finding joy in all circumstances, that deep, inexpressible, glorious joy, is by learning how to clothe ourselves with the character trait of humility. Humility. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but humility is quite hard to see at the moment. It's incredibly hard to find, and I'm not just talking about across the pond. You don't need to look to America. You can see it in our own nation. And what we see happening, particularly in politics, but in other areas as well, is that arrogance and pride seems to be having its heyday at the moment. Humility isn't valued. Instead, confidence and arrogance and pride seems to be the thing that's drawing us to certain people. It's hard to find at the moment in politics. Humility is also, I would argue, quite hard to find at work. Like, you don't often hear about someone getting a promotion because they decided to make their entire life's work about promoting somebody else. It's often, look at me, look at what I've done, therefore promote me because of what I am doing. It tends to be the way businesses are run, the way our culture is run, but it's also quite hard to find in relationships, because humility requires us to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable is dangerous because it opens ourselves up to getting hurt. And so we don't find humility around a lot. And it kind of makes sense because it's a kind of part of the culture that we swim in, that we live our lives in. Humility, in a sense, you could say, is akin to self-repression. Whereas the opposite of that is what gets valued. We value expressive individualism. So true satisfaction is found through intimate contact, if you like, with ourselves. It's about loving ourselves. It's finding the beauty from within, the power and the divinity in ourselves. If I see one more t-shirt that my children want to buy in a clothes shop that says, "Do what makes you happy," I'm going to start throwing them away, because it's just a part of the general zeitgeist of what we see all the time. It's become a slogan. Make it about yourself and you'll be happy. It seems to be the world that we swim in. And I want to say, in this letter to the church in Philippi, it was no different then. 2,000 years ago, this word humility was not a good term. It was not a compliment to be told that you were humble. In fact, in Greek literature at the time, it was pretty much exclusively reserved for those who would be slaves of other people. So they're owned by other people. Really, it was akin to humiliation. We're humiliated. It wasn't a good thing. But then you have this letter to the church in Philippi, and you've got the whole of the New Testament as a whole. And in the New Testament, the word for humility in the ancient Greek is used 270 times, and it's almost exclusively used as a positive term. Completely flies in the face of the culture of the time, as it also completely, I would argue, flies in the culture of our present time. Humility is almost always used in a positive sense. And in fact, in this, as we'll see, humility is the pathway to joy. So, why is that the case? Why is it that humility is so valued? Why is it that Paul and Jesus and other New Testament writers are saying, if you value humility over arrogance and pride, you're going to experience joy? Instead of it being about humiliation, this is actually about something that lifts you up and gives you strength. Let's have a little look at some verses here. Let's start with our passage for this morning that we'll keep coming back to. For Paul, his joy would have been made complete if the church in Philippi understood humility. So joy gets made complete in and through humility. And then he talks there about valuing others above yourself. And there's lots in there about community. It's also the way in which we experience week 1 of this series, in which we experience that koinonia fellowship, the beautiful giving of ourselves to one another. The way to live that, the character trait we need in order to be able to live out that life of community is one of humility. But let's look further afield from other passages. Here's 1 Peter chapter 5. He says this. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. I don't know if you've ever woken up in the morning, and if you believe in God, if you don't believe in God, it doesn't matter. But if you believe in God, and you just thought, well, as soon as you've woken up in the morning, I quite fancy opposing God today. In fact, I'm going to make it my aim to come against God, to have a battle with God. How many of you know that's probably going to be a losing battle? You're not going to win that one. So how do we get in line with God and his heart and his character? How do we gain his favor? Humility. Humility. But it's not something that we necessarily think about all the time. Humility. It's also here in terms of our purpose and our meaning in life. So in Matthew 5, Jesus says, blessed are the meek, happy are the meek. It's a partner word with humility there in the Greek. For they will inherit the earth. Who inherits the earth according to the world's standards? Those who are strong, those who are arrogant, those who are proud, those who have the right qualities, those who are capable in and of themselves. Jesus flips the whole thing on its head and says the meek will inherit the earth, the humble. It says here in Matthew 20, not so with you. They're arguing basically about who's going to be the greatest. Classic argument. We have it all the time. We probably don't have it out loud most of the time, but we certainly have it as an inner dialogue. He says, instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Remember, servant was a dirty word. This was being owned by somebody else. It was a horrible thing. It was humiliating. Jesus says you have to become like a servant in order to be great. Finally, in Luke 14, he says, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, humiliated, and those who humble themselves, the character trait of humility, themselves will be exalted. So if we want to find our true purpose, because by the way, in terms of inheriting the earth, rule and reigning over the earth, that is our role as humanity. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We aren't to see greatness as a dirty word. Greatness is a good thing. You were made for greatness, but the way in isn't through our own capability. It's actually through humility. What else does humility give us then? Why do we need to take humility seriously? Well, humility can also supercharge our prayer life. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of praying and being like, why isn't God listening to me? I'm praying again and again, and God's not listening. We'll read this from 2 Chronicles. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven. There's a condition there. Humility opens the ears of God to hear our prayer. Matthew 11, Jesus says this. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father. He's basically just realized that the disciples, despite being an absolute joke, idiots in many ways, suddenly understand the gospel. And he says, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned, and you've revealed them to little children. The most humble among us, those who humiliate themselves in many ways. It supercharges our prayer, but it also opens our ears to hear the voice of God. We can hear revelation. We can hear God's will and God's plan for our lives if we are humble. And then finally, and this is my favorite, Jesus says this in Matthew 11, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." It's right at the heart of Jesus' character, humility, and you will find rest for your souls. Your souls, the very essence of who you are, can only be found, rest can only be found in the person of Jesus. And Jesus characterizes himself as humble, lowly in heart. If we want to find true rest, then we find it in the humility of Jesus. Okay, so humility is a good thing. Humility is something that we should be longing for as the people of God. It's something that we should be clothing ourselves in. It's something that should drive us in all that we do. So the next question we should probably ask is, well, what is humility? Let's understand humility. Here's humility from Philippians. Firstly, humility, according to Paul in Philippians 2, is doing nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Okay? So promoting yourself, absolutely nothing that you do should be about yourself, okay? It doesn't say 50% of the time. So when you wake up in the morning, you think, okay, 50% of my day today, I'm going to make about other people, and then I'll just do the other 50% about myself. Paul says, absolutely nothing. 100% of your life is meant for other people, nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. What else does he say about humility? He says that humility is about valuing others above yourself. So you remember when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Paul's going even further, he says, value them above yourself. Put them before yourself. What else does he say humility is? He says, don't look to your own interest, but look to the interests of others. Have your eyes fixed on other people and what they need. Don't think at all about what you need. What else does he say about humility? He says, make yourself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant. So if we want to be humble, we have to make ourselves nothing, not something, nothing, absolutely nothing. Become like a servant. Servants were nothing because they were owned by other people. What else does he say about humility? He says, become obedient. I hate doing what other people tell me to do. Not so. If you want to be humble, you need to be obedient, but not just obedient, you need to die. If you want to be humble, you've got to die. So, good luck. I hope it goes well, and I'll see you next week. Well, probably won't, actually, to be honest, after you've heard that. I wouldn't come back. Now, the thing is about these sorts of instructions is God doesn't tell us to do something without giving us the means to actually live it out. So the question we need to ask is, that sounds impossible. How are we to live our lives like that? And God says, let me show you, let me help you, let me be humility for you so that you can truly clothe yourselves in humility. So, what is humility? Humility is all those things. That is the substance of humility. I love how practical that list is. Like, he means it. He means when you walk around in your day, do nothing out of selfish ambition. So if you're thinking that you're doing something for yourself, he's saying you've lost. You're not humble anymore. Do stuff for other people. Value others above yourself. It is deeply, deeply practical. But let's just kind of reverse back a bit. Let's get a bigger picture of what humility is. So humility, according to the New Testament, according to God, isn't what we think of humility in the world these days. So if you look at a definition of humility, often the definitions of humility that we have in the world are about thinking less of yourself. For example, in the Cambridge definition of the word humility, it says you need to be aware of your bad qualities. Be aware, become aware of your bad qualities. So according to that, if you want to be humble, you wake up in the morning and you kind of say to God, Lord, make me aware of my bad qualities today. If you make me aware of my bad qualities, then I'll be able to be humble. I don't know if you've ever been to a church like this, but there are certain churches, often reformed in theology, who just emphasize the fact the whole time that you are miserable, that you're sinners. In fact, you're a slug. And if you wake up every morning, just beat your chest and say, I'm a slug, I'm a slug, I'm a slug, you'll be able to live the Christian life. Is that life in all its fullness? Sounds absolutely miserable to me. I actually don't think thinking less of yourself is Christian at all. Yes, understand that you're a sinner saved by grace. Yes, the way in is always through the perfection of Jesus. But I want to argue, actually thinking less of yourself is just another form of pride. Pride is at the root of sin. What is sin? It's a life turned in on itself. It's a life centered on yourself. You've made everything about yourself. You are at the center. When you give your life to Jesus instead, you repent from that lifestyle and you put Jesus at the center and you choose to live your life for him. So if all we're ever doing is beating our chests and declaring that we're a slug and that we're miserable and we're worthless and we're nothing, we're actually just committing another form of pride. We're thinking about ourselves all of the time. We're making the whole of life about ourselves. This is just another form of sin wrapped up in something that sounds even more miserable. A self-pity party is actually the opposite of humility. It's pride. Okay, so what about another definition there? This is often the definition that Christians give for humility. I've heard this a lot. People say that humility is about thinking about yourselves less. So not thinking less of yourselves, but thinking about yourself less. Now, I don't know if you've ever woken up in the morning and decided to think about yourself less for a day. I did it the other day because I wanted to test it so I could tell you about it. I woke up in the morning, I said, today I ain't going to think about myself less. Failed straight away, but we'll restart. Started again. I'm going to think about myself less. And then I went half an hour, thought about myself. In fact, I say half an hour, 30 seconds. 20 seconds later, thought about myself. A minute later, thought about myself. 2 minutes later, thought about myself. Went the whole day. In fact, when I tried to think about myself less, I think I thought about myself more than I've ever thought about myself in my entire life. Have you ever had someone say to you, whatever you do, don't picture an elephant in your mind right now? What are you all thinking? What are you all seeing? An elephant. If you just try to think about yourself less, it's impossible. There's no way of doing it. Like, it's actually not about thinking about ourselves less because it is impossible to do. And here's why it's impossible to do. You have needs. I have needs. We need affirmation. We need love. We need value. We need to know that we mean something. We need a sense of worth and significance. So if we just try and think about ourselves, if we neglect ourselves, if you like, it's impossible to do. Your mind's just going to go back round again and again to your own needs and your own need for significance. So I don't think it's about thinking less of ourselves. It's also not thinking about ourselves less. So the key question we have to ask is, well, what is humility? According to the New Testament, what's humility? Well, in the Greek, the word humility means actually not thinking about yourself less or thinking less of yourself. The word humility means to think about yourself in the right way. It means thinking about yourself rightly. How do I know that? Well, it's actually in this passage. In fact, it comes out beautifully in this passage. Paul tells us in the famous passage there that we had read by Mary, he says, have the same mindset as Jesus. So the same mind as Jesus. Mindset, it's a beautiful word when you think about it. It means have your mind concrete, have it set on this, okay? And what does he say to have our mind set on? He says, have the main mindset as Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Now often, when people hear that or they read that, they see the negative there. Don't think of yourself as using something to your own advantage. And we just think in the negative the whole time. Can't take advantage, when actually we miss the miracle in that statement. We miss the unbelievable thing Paul is saying there. He's saying, have the same mindset as Jesus. By the way, Jesus' mindset was that he knew that in his very nature, he was God. He knew he was God. You see, when you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus didn't think less of himself. He didn't think of himself less. He knew exactly who he was. He lived the most beautiful life of secure identity and having his worth and his significance in his created identity. In fact, the reason that Jesus got killed was because he made statements like this. If you've seen me, you've seen God. That is not somebody who thinks less of himself. Also not somebody who thinks of himself less. If you've seen me, you've seen God. He said elsewhere, I and the Father are one. We're one. We're the same. If you want to know what God is like, look at the person of Jesus. In other words, he knew that in his very nature, he was God. But he didn't consider that as something to take to his own advantage. So the key for Christian humility, if we want to learn how to be humble like Jesus, we need to know who we are. We need to have a secure identity. It's back to what Liam was talking about last week. We have to have our secure identity in God. And when we hear that, we think, well, that sounds like pride. Sounds like arrogance, actually. So if the solution for Christians to living a humble life is actually to recognize and realize that we are in our very nature God, we're divine, imagine that if you go to work, you say, I can actually value you above myself because I'm God. Have you noticed? And they'll say, absolutely not. Never seen that in you at all, actually. How do we know? How do we know we're God? Well, we know we're God. We can live out our created identity of having our significance and our worth and our security in God. Why? Because of the person of Jesus. And this is what this whole passage is about. It centers on the person of Jesus, because what Paul is saying there is he was in his very nature God, but he didn't consider his equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage. He didn't rock up and say, look at me, I am king, bow down and worship me. What he did instead is he became obedient. What did he become obedient to? To the will of the Father. What was the will of the Father? To die and to sacrifice himself for many, so that everyone who then puts their trust in him, believes in him, can then become the people you were created to be. Truly humble, filled to overflowing with the divinity of Jesus. Let me point this out in some passages. So Genesis, I quote this all the time, but this is a return to our original identity. If you want to know how to be humble, you have to know this in our heart, in our mind. We have to live this, that we were created in the image and likeness of God. Now that's a substantive term. That's not that we look a bit like God. That's that we literally carry his glory and his power. And so we're carriers of God's glory. The sooner we realize that, the sooner we're able to be humble. Let me trace this through into the New Testament, because, of course, in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve tragically didn't believe that, and they looked for it elsewhere. And the whole of creation unraveled as a result. But then because of Jesus, Jesus pops up on the scene, and Jesus is the first fully filled spirit man. So he is both fully divine and fully human. He shows us what it is like to be truly human. And because of his death on the cross, all those who look to him then get this benefit. You ready? Paul in 2 Corinthians. God made him, Jesus, who had no sin, never fell short of the glory of God, never made life about himself, no pride, no arrogance, made him who had no sin to be sin for us. So Jesus on the cross took upon himself our own arrogance, our own pride, our own self-pity. Why did he do that? He did that so that we could declare ourselves slugs and say that we're sinners all the time. Absolutely not. Why did he do it? So that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now that is we could spend like the whole of the next 20 minutes on that word righteousness. But this is not just right relationship with God, right relationship with other people. This is us living in our created identity as image bearers of the divine, of God himself. Next verse says in Ephesians, this is Paul, he says, have the same attitude. He's encouraging the church in Ephesus in your minds. Put on your new self. He talks about the old self, which is basically essentially pride and arrogance. And then he says, you are created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So when you believe in Jesus, you become holy, blemish-free. You're set apart from all of creation. When God looks upon you, he sees the perfection of his Son. You become an image bearer. You become like him. This one really shows it. Look at this in Romans 8. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son. So this is why we talk about becoming like Jesus all of the time. Our calling as Christians is to become like Jesus. We're to be conformed to the image of his Son. Essentially, we're to become who we were created to be. We're to have that return to our original identity, so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. He glorified them. So when you chose to believe in Jesus, if you've chosen to believe in Jesus, you became glorified. You became glorified. You received glory. In essence, you became the person you were created to be. Your significance, your worth, your value came from your created identity lived in and through the relationship with Jesus, but image bearers of the living God, carrying his glory, his character. And Paul puts it beautifully in 2 Corinthians. He talks in 2 Corinthians about us with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of God. And then we go from one degree of glory to another. In other words, we become more like God as we behold God. We'll come back to that in a second. But the question then is, okay, so if that's what true humility is, it's not about thinking less of yourselves. It's not about thinking of yourself less. It's actually thinking of yourself rightly. It's knowing who you are in Christ, knowing that you're an image bearer. You carry the glory and the power of God. You are God on earth. If that is what true humility is, the question is still, how on earth do we get it? Because I don't know if you've noticed this, if you go around telling everybody that you're God, it doesn't go well for you. In fact, they'll probably think you're proud and arrogant, for good reason. So how do we do it? Okay, so the key is in this little word here. It says here that at the beginning, do nothing out of self-ambition or vain conceits. That word, when you translate it literally, means glory empty. Empty of glory. So what Paul's saying there is that we are empty of glory because of sin. Because of the fall, because of our own sin, we've emptied ourselves of the glory of God. God used to live, we were created to have God live within us, but because of our selfishness, our pride, our arrogance, our life turned in on itself, God's glory departed. And so therefore we then have this part of our created identity that can only be filled with glory. And what we do in our sin is we look everywhere else to try and fill that hole with glory. So we look to our job and say, will that bring me glory? We look to relationships, will that bring me glory? We look to possessions and money, will that bring me glory? We look to any and which way so as to be filled with glory, when what we don't know is the only way that that emptiness, that hole that needs to be filled with glory, can be filled with glory is by looking to God. And in and through the personal relationship with Jesus, we get filled with glory instead. God can make us glorious. And just to kind of do the full circle on the passage, for the three of you that still read paper Bibles, you'll notice that this part of the passage is set apart in a different stanza. So it's got the normal passage and it's kind of set apart. And some people are like, well, why is it like that? It's like that because it was a song. So this was a verse from a song. It might have been a poem, but it's probably most likely a song. This is a song that they would have sung together. In other words, it's a worship song. So this is Paul saying, if you want to have humility, if you want to clothe yourselves with humility, if you want to be full with glory, you need to worship like this. Who being in very nature, this worshipping Jesus, he is in his nature God. He didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He made himself nothing. Worship, worship, worship. What is it? It's lifting our eyes off of ourselves and instead choosing to place our eyes on the person of Jesus, who's seated on a throne. At his name, every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that he is Lord. If we want to be humble, we have to see God rightly. And only then can we see ourselves rightly. We lift our eyes to heaven. And here's how it's played out in Romans. I don't have time to go into the full context of this. But this, again, is a worship song. In Romans, Paul explains the gospel, how Jesus has essentially enabled us to become the people we were created to be. And then it gets too much for him. And he bursts into song, and the scribe, or himself if he was writing it, but the scribe just keeps writing. And he says here, oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgment. He's worshipping here. He says, who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? From him, through him, for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. He's worshipping. He's taking his eyes off of himself. He's lifting his eyes to God, and then that's how we start to live the life of humility. Watch this. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, the only way through is the person of Jesus, who's perfect in every way, died on the cross. When we believe in him, we have access to our Father. We, in view of his mercy, we offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, set apart, pleasing to God. This is our true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, that essentially says that hole within you that needs to be filled with glory can be filled if you focus on yourself, if you do things out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Instead, conform to the pattern of heaven and be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That word transformed is used very lightly in the New Testament because it is a powerful term. It's the same word that we use, metamorpho, which is we use to go from a caterpillar to a butterfly. If you like, from a slug to a butterfly. So if we want to stop being sinners and slugs, we worship Jesus as our God and as our Savior and as our Lord. And what happens is he fills us with his glory and his spirit, and he transforms us into people of glory. We become the glory of God on earth, not because of anything we can do, because of all that he has done. And when we are secure in that, when we truly understand that, then we can be humble. We can make our lives about others. Why? Because our needs are already met in him. Our need for affirmation, our need for love, the needs that we have that are deep within us, that we look everywhere to get satisfied in and through our relationship with God. And then we get to live lives of humility. Okay, so we need to learn to worship. And worship, as you know, as is in that passage, is a whole life thing. This is something we do with our entire lives. But it's not less than the worship that we do in church. So it is a part of our worship. So I want to just give us, just this week, how is your worship life going? Like, day to day, how are you worshiping God? And by worshiping God, what I'm talking about is putting worth to God, giving worth to God. How is that going for you? When you wake up in the morning, is your first thought about yourself? Or do you redirect it and say, God, I praise you, I worship you, I love you, I thank you? As you go throughout your day and stuff's coming at your way and you're getting overwhelmed, you take yourself aside and you say, Jesus, thank you that you are gentle, you're lowly in heart, that I can give the burden to you and you'll give me rest in this moment. How are we worshiping God in our day to day? Because the more we're able to do that, the more we're able to actually clothe ourselves with humility, which is a fruit of the Spirit, and then we experience true joy. The joy, by the way, of not living our life focused on ourselves. I don't know if you've ever tried living your whole life focused on yourself. It is miserable. It's very hard to find joy. The solution is to fix our eyes on Jesus. Let's stand, and we're going to spend a bit of time doing that now. And let's just get ourselves in a posture of openness and of worship. Shut our eyes, open our hands. If you wouldn't consider yourself to be a Christian, if you're just checking things out, then this is a moment, if you want to invite God to meet you. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can open yourself to him now, and he will show you that he loves you. So you can pray a really simple prayer, like, Lord, would you show me you're real? Show me your character. And for the rest of us, let's just start to turn our attention again towards God. I will give you all my worship. I will give you all my praise. You alone I long to worship. You alone are worthy of my praise. And I will give Lord, I give you my life, I give you my soul. I live for you alone, every breath that I take, every moment I'm away. Lord, have your way in me, and Lord, I give you my life, I give you my soul. Lord, teach us to worship. Teach us to worship you in spirit and in truth. Teach us to worship you with all our heart, mind, soul, strength. Thank you for your presence here this morning. Just keep receiving. The Spirit is here and he's filling us afresh with his glory. There's a number of people I'd love to pray for this morning. I'd love to pray for people here this morning who feel exhausted or feel restless. I would love to pray this morning that we would find our rest in him, that we would experience his gentle, humble rest and presence. There's people here this morning who have that soundtrack going on in your mind of being less than, not worthy, a sinner, of just constantly having negative thoughts about yourself. This morning, in a moment, I'd love you to come forward and hear what God says over you. This is my son. This is my daughter. With him, with her, I am pleased. I'm proud of you. It's easy for me to say. It's powerful when you hear that from the Father in heaven. And then there's others of us who just have needs that need to be met this morning. You just have something that you need God to come through on for you. I'd love you to come forward and let's just pray that the Spirit meets you and gives you what you need. He's a good Father. He gives good gifts to those who ask. So we get to just ask him, here's what I need, Lord. Thank you, Jesus. So if you're in any of those groups, do you want to start coming forward? Even if you're not and you want prayer, can you please come forward? We'd love to pray for you about absolutely anything. We love also to pray for physical healing. So if you need physical healing,